Do-do-do-do. Manam do. Oh, hello there. We're live now, aren't we? Well, then, welcome to week 2 of Ancient Civilizations Home Edition. I'm going to begin by talking through some business, talk through the things, then we'll have a shorter than last week, I think, slideshow of some interesting things from Mesoamerica, specifically the Mayan region, and also some other areas as well, that I think will supplement what you've read in the textbook. There's no shortcut to reading in the home edition, but hopefully when you go through the slides, you'll see some interesting things. I got a new monitor, and that's where all my notes and control panels and stuff are, so if I'm looking over here, it's because I'm going to pause us for a second. And then I'll switch back over here. And I'll remind you that the email announcement that you received that had the link that you probably clicked on to get here, if that slides down in your email or you lose it or you just want to go back and find it again, you can always click here to the announcements. These will be out by at least Monday morning, although you probably have already gotten it by now because I wanted to have it here. You'll see that it's pinned on the top. You click right here and you get the same thing that arrived in your email. You might want to print this out and use it as a checklist to keep on track. In brief, this week, I want you to go through this mini lecture, listen to me, talk about the things. Then I want to watch this fantastic video. It's an episode of Nova called Cracking the Maya Code. It is about the decipherment of the Mayan script, the writing system, and some of the fantastic things that we've learned about the Mayan civilization since we can now read what they wrote about themselves. And then, of course, you got to read the textbook chapter. Here's a chapter from Jared Diamond's Collapse, wherein you might imagine that he pins the end of the classic Mayan period on ecocide. And you might also imagine that Patricia McInerney and her colleague, somebody Negron, have a very different understanding of what happened there. Once you've watched the things and read the things, then you should do the discussion forum. This will help you write better answers for the assignments, and you can earn those sweet, sweet discussion points. And then do the regular Mayan assignment, and somewhere along the way, there's a second research paper assignment wherein you're supposed to find some sources. And I'll talk about all of these things in a sec. You can always find this stuff down here also in the section of the course web dedicated to the week of 30 March. Here's a link to the mini lecture that I'm recording right now. Wait a minute. If he's recording it now, how can it be there? What happens if I click on it now? Oh no! He didn't! Oh yes. Yes, he did. It would be fun for me if somebody clicked that link before I completed this video lecture and replaced the link. I wonder if anyone will. Let me know. That would be funny. I think the first thing to do is to look at the research paper assignment. You click here. I'll give you some instructions. Basically, what you're supposed to do is follow up on the topic that you picked in the assignment for last week. And here, I want you to use the bibliography of the readings related to the topic that you picked to find 2 sources that are cited in those readings. So, for example, if you were to have picked a research paper topic related to the dating of the first settlement of Easter Island, of Rapa Nui, then you would want to look in Diamond and in the Hunt and Lippo article from Questioning Collapse and find the scholarly sources that they cited for the time for when they say that radiocarbon dates show that people first settled on Rapa Nui at blank year. Find those sources, those actual sources, by using the library website. Then I want you to find 2 additional scholarly sources that have been published since our course materials were written. This is where you're going to have to spend some time going down a rabbit hole, doing searches on the library website in order to find something that's more recent than the things that I have assigned for you to read. So an example would be this article here. Let me show you how I found that. Let's see, library website. I'm going to open that up in another tab here. And yes, we know. And what if I want to see, gosh, Hunt and Lippo, they have this idea that moving moai did not require logs and was not probably a factor in the deforestation of the island. That's a pretty big assertion for them to make. I should hope they will have published their findings somewhere in an academic journal. So let's see. Hunt, Lippo, moai. Do a search. And what do you know? The very first hit is an article called The Walking Megalithic Statues, Moai, of Easter Island. You click here, you can view the full text online. Got to log on to the library. And boom! There's a Journal of Archaeological Science article from a couple years ago. And this is wherein they describe their methodology and findings for the walking moai experiment that was featured in that episode of Nova. So there you go. If your research topic that you identified last time had to do with wood usage, deforestation, etc., this would be a really great article to use for your research paper. If you do this assignment and you find 2 scholarly sources that are mentioned in the readings and then 2 more recent ones, you will be on the way to having the materials that you need to write the research paper in a couple weeks. So that's why this is so important to do. You'll also get some points for doing it, so it'll contribute towards the total of the research paper. And a way to start would be to list some keywords related to your research topic. You can look back at the text that you wrote for the last assignment and then start punching those keywords and author names into the search bar at the library website, and eventually you too will come up with some really neat stuff. That's all you have to do. And I'm back. I think having these face-to-face or virtual face-to-face segments between sections of the mini lecture are helpful, because now if you're fast forwarding and rewinding through this later on as you're doing the work, this will be a way for you to mark where we move on to the material of the week, which has to do with Mesoamerica. But first, I want to tell you about one very minor change I've made. Last week, the discussion forums were listed at the top, and all the questions were mixed up. From now on, there's going to be a weekly discussion forum in each section based on the topic of the week. And so if you click here, you'll see that I've already seeded it with about a half dozen questions for you to answer. Just like last time, you won't see other people's response until you have written something. But once you do, then you'll unlock everybody else's responses. Many of these questions are similar to or components of the assignment questions. So if you do this throughout the week, you're going to write much better answers. I'm going to rate the things. Like if you posted anything on last week's assignments, you've seen that I already have, and you can get up to 5 points for a really strong answer. And you do that again, you get another 5 points. And like I said, you get 25 points. You get the total participation for the second half of the class. And anything beyond 25 points is just sweet, sweet extra credit. Rack up the points. Think of this as an alternate way to do as well as you possibly can in this chaotic and kind of weird situation that we all been thrown into. And now, shall we get to the main event? I'd like to keep this to be about a 30-minute mini lecture instead of a 60-minute mini lecture, so I'm going to stop talking now and move right on. And when I want to start something, I often go to The Simpsons.
Now, young fellow, I haven't forgotten you. Here.
Wow, a crowbar.
This is
Just
from
open
one
the
of the
crate,
first seasons
stupid.
when The
What
Simpsons
did I
were still
tell
actually
you?
funny.
I'll bet it's filled with diamonds, rubies, sapphires, pearls.
Wow, a big ugly head.
Actually, son, it's a big, ugly, Olmec Indian head. It was carved by Mesoamerican Indians over 3,000 years ago. This gruesome customer is Extrapolapaketl, the god of war.
Awesome.
If there were any fewer
Maggie,
pixels,
not Aztec. Olmec. Olmec.
Marge, what does it do?
Doesn't do anything.
you will know the difference
Marge,
between
really,
Aztec
what does
and
it
Olmec.
do?
Whatever it does, it's doing it now.
Well, I'll let you get acquainted with Senor Extrapolapaketl. Ta! Did you see their faces, Smithers?
Sir, you're my god of generosity.
Save a guy's life, and what do you get? Nothing. Worse than nothing. Just a big, scary rock.
Hey, man, don't badmouth the head.
Homer, it's the thought that counts. The moral of this story is a good deed is its own reward.
Hey, we got a reward. The head is cool.
Well, then, I guess the moral is no good deed goes unrewarded.
Wait a minute. If I hadn't written that nasty letter, we wouldn't have gotten anything.
Well, then I guess the moral is the squeaky wheel gets the grease.
Perhaps there is no moral to this story.
Exactly. It's just a bunch of stuff that happened.
But it certainly was a memorable few days.
Amen to that.
Well, that was time well spent, wasn't it? I like this because, you know, in return for saving Mr. Burns' life through a blood transfusion, he rewards the Simpson family by giving them a giant Olmec head, and then cute little Maggie holds up a flashcard that says Aztec, and Lisa corrects her and says, "No, that's not an Aztec head. That's an Olmec artifact." You know, sort of explaining to the baby. Well, you know, y'all be able to do that after this week, after having spent a week with readings and films on Mesoamerica. And, you know, Mesoamerica is an incredibly important region. It spans most of Mexico and Central America here. And although it's relatively small, it was the home to a variety of distinct yet interrelated cultures. What I mean by that is that each of these areas, the basin of Mexico, this is where Mexico City is, the valley of Oaxaca, this is a highland valley in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, the Olmec lowlands. Whoops. Note how this lowland area continues along the coast up through Texas into Louisiana and even up the Mississippi. So it's not so far-fetched that in the days before national borders that Native American peoples would have had contacts and communication all through this region. It's just something important to keep in mind when we think about the Mesoamerican connections that we saw at Cahokia and Chaco much later in time. And then the major focus for this week is on the Mayan region over here. Now, the social and cultural developments in all of these areas are distinct from one another, but because they're in close connection or in close geographical proximity, you might expect that they had a lot of interactions with one another. And this all began early on, about 1000 BC or so, with the emergence of political centers, maybe even call them kingdoms, in the Olmec lowlands down here, where this purple point is just sort of floating. If we zoom in on that purple point a little bit, and we look at archaeological sites, all of these red dots are are important Olmec centers. This is probably not was definitely not a politically unified area, but rather all of these centers were developed out of a common cultural heritage, and in each of these places, aspiring elites used a similar ideological vocabulary to build and demonstrate their power. The most famous item of this ideological vocabulary are the giant stone heads. This one here is from the site of San Lorenzo, located right here, smack dab in the center of the Olmec lowlands. It's where a whole bunch of streams run into the Gulf from the mountains, run into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's really fantastic. There's many of these things that are made from volcanic stone basalt that was sourced in the hills, and so brought 10, sometimes up to 100 miles away. So to have one of these things carved in your image is a clear demonstration of an individual ruler's power to convince or coerce people to haul the stone, to carve the stone, to build the things. We've seen this before. Fader described monumental architecture as one of the signs of a socially complex society or civilization. We clearly see all that stuff coming into play during the Olmec period, beginning at about 1000 BC or so. That's the big head that was being referred to in that Simpsons episode. Here's a shot of La Venta. Note that it's a large earthen pyramid at one end of a plaza, almost Cahokia-like, but 2,000 years earlier. This basic pattern of centers of political power being based around large monumental constructions and surrounded by residences of people who want to be close to power is an important trend that we'll see in all of those Mesoamerican societies and even further north. Part of the symbolic and ideological vocabulary of aspiring Olmec rulers that would continue on also in other later Mesoamerican societies or civilizations is exemplified in this little figurine. It's about 6 inches tall. I'm sorry, it doesn't have a scale. It's also from La Venta, and it's made out of jade. That's an important material that was more important than gold for more valuable than gold for aspiring rulers in all the Mesoamerican areas. This figure represents a jaguar with human features, or a human with jaguar features. It's called a were-jaguar. That's what our historians call it. And so the jaguar as well would be an important symbol. Later on, I'll briefly talk about the way in which Mayan rulers built power, demonstrated their power through trade connections that allowed them to get things like jaguar pelts to demonstrate that, well, they had them and everybody else didn't. This is also from La Venta. Here we see the were-jaguar iconography, part of that symbolic vocabulary on this. This is like a large bench. Like, we can imagine that the ruler of La Venta would have sat up here, or had a platform or a chair or something like that sitting up here. And here he is symbolically emerging from the underworld. That's how Mesoamerican art historians understand this. And so here we have a ruler being looked over by this mythical were-jaguar figure coming out from the underworld. This would seem to be a physical manifestation, representation of shamanism and the role that the shamanism played in the development of political power. This is, again, an important common theme in all of these different areas, such that political rulers had important spiritual functions as well in society. Another bit of common ideological vocabulary that was developed at these Olmec centers beginning around 1000 BC is the use of writing. Olmec writing would go on to develop in different ways in different regions, and epigraphers, the people who study ancient writing, can trace the development of later Mayan writing from earlier Olmec writing. So this is a figure from a place called Tuxtla, and it actually dates to a little bit later, quite a bit later, actually 162 AD. How do we know 162 AD? That's extraordinarily precise. Remember, radiocarbon dating, for example, is based upon instrumental technique that measures the amount of radioactive carbon-14 that remains in a sample, and it has an error bar of depending on the size of the sample and the age of anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand years. It's imprecise. It's based on the context of organic material with the thing that we want to date. So how can we figure out that this was 162 AD? Because if you look real close, right down in there, here's a drawing of the thing. That is a date in the Mesoamerican calendrical system. So, and this is a glyph, a symbol for a place. All these are, actually. So this figure that has some features of a duck as well as some features of a human is carved in jade, has writing on it indicating different places as well as a date, was probably representative of or a gift to a ruler who came to power and maybe had influence over these places. And perhaps it was even for a coronation of a ruler in the Olmec area in 162 AD. So the use of writing as well as calendar systems is something that developed during Olmec times and went on to be further developed in those other Mesoamerican regions. It's just some the way I mentioned earlier that epigraphers can see the development of symbols and common symbols used in Mayan writing, Zapotec writing, Mixtec writing, Aztec iconography, and epi-Olmec symbols. So for this reason, the importance of the Olmec has sometimes been described as there having been a mother culture to other Mesoamerican regions, as if all these elements of ideological vocabulary first emerged here and then spread outwards. That's not really terribly current anymore. Olszewski does not talk about the Olmec as being a mother culture, and that's because most Mesoamerican archaeologists that work in these other regions, in the Mayan area, in the Valley of Oaxaca, in the Valley of Mexico, they also see similar developments of this formative ideological vocabulary also were developing simultaneously at the early layers in all of these areas. So it's as if maybe the Olmec, rather than being a mother culture, was more of a sister culture, and that all of these areas had emerging elites beginning around 1000 BC or so that were interacting with one another. Now I'm going to skate on ahead to the basin of Mexico, or the Valley of Mexico. It's a valley, it's a highland valley where Mexico City is currently located. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Let's try that again. Let's skate on ahead to the basin of Mexico, or the Valley of Mexico, located where modern-day Mexico City is. It's a highland area. It's a higher elevation. It's surrounded by mountains, and it's a basin up in there. And the first place I want to talk about is Teotihuacan, which would grow to become one of the largest cities in the world during the first 1,000 years AD. So this is much late. This city, Teotihuacan, is much later than the Olmec societies. And while I have the map here, the basin of Mexico, Mexico City, at the time that the Spanish arrived in around 1520, 1521, the conquest of the Aztecs, Teotihuacan had already been abandoned for hundreds of years. And the Aztecs believed that the ancient ruins of Teotihuacan were a place where their mythical ancestors had lived. And so Teotihuacan actually means the home of the gods in the Aztecs' Nahuatl language. So this place, Teotihuacan, was occupied from about the time of Christ, 0 AD. There's earlier settlement there, of course, but it becomes a proper city sometime between 0 and 100 AD, and then continues on until 700, 800 AD. So the city of Teotihuacan was occupied during the time of the Mayan kingdoms that are the focus of the readings this week, and definitely had their interactions between one of the largest cities in the world at the time in the basin of Mexico, and what was going on in the Mayan area. And that's the first question in the assignment that I asked you to write, and I'll go through that in a little bit. But never estimate the power of a good volcano. So in this area of the basin of Mexico, around Lake Texcoco, note that there's not a lake there really anymore. The Aztecs converted part of the lake into agricultural land, and now Mexico City is on top of it. But anyway, back in the day, from about 3000 to 100 BC, there's all sorts of villages and emerging towns surrounding in the basin of Mexico, surrounding Lake Texcoco. And then sometime around 50 BC or so, a volcano went off and caused great disruption. The city of Cuicuilco was pretty much destroyed, and there seems to have been a huge migration of people into Teotihuacan that became the capital of at least city-state, and some might even say a kingdom or maybe even an empire in central Mexico. And that's how Teotihuacan became this huge city. And boom, it's on my bucket list. I haven't been there, so this is something I pulled off the interwebs, but this is the Pyramid of the Sun. And it sits right in the center of this well-planned, organized city. As people moved into Teotihuacan around 100 AD or so, there seems to have been a massive urban renewal project wherein there was a grid laid out, and most of these red squares here represent they were multi-story apartment buildings, and different neighborhoods had communities from different parts of Mesoamerica. So people were coming from the Gulf lowlands, from Chiapas, even from the Mayan area, setting and coming to live in neighborhoods in this very well-planned and organized city. And we know that because they produced pottery in their local styles. They had food preferences and cuisine that was characteristic of their quote home regions, or at least where their families had originally come from before migrating to this huge city of Teotihuacan. And more recently, it's been impossible to study the chemical signatures of people's teeth and find that they were born in the Mayan region, in Chiapas region, in Oaxaca, etc. That's pretty cool. This urban renewal project by the powers that were at Teotihuacan was very much a spiritual or had important symbolic significance to it, so that if you were to be at the top of the Pyramid of the Moon and look at the Pyramid of the Sun and follow that line of sight, like so. This is a photograph from the top of the Pyramid of the Moon looking to the Pyramid of the Sun. The layout actually mirrors the mountains in the back. In some ways, it would seem that Teotihuacan was redesigned after the destruction of Cuicuilco as a place that could symbolically be considered the center of the universe. And that is something that many Mayans rulers and kings aspired to as they developed their cities as well. Unlike the Mayan region, Teotihuacano society was not literate. They did not cover their temples and pyramids with writing describing telling the names and the royal genealogies of their rulers. Rather, Teotihuacan's rulers seem to have been depicted in an almost faceless sort of way, so that perhaps it was the position of king that was more important than the individual who was in the role. Maybe it was more of a hierarchically organized council sort of government, maybe not unlike Athens during the classical period in 200 AD or so, when it was more about the citizenry and the rulers than the actual named kings, as it was in Sparta, but now I digress. Finally, can we go to the Mayan region? Remember, the Mayan region also has its cultural origins in what we call Olmec society, using that ideological and symbolic vocabulary. But it's over here. It spans both the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas over here, and also lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula and Belize. And gradually the land goes from the highlands and gets lower and lower and lower until when you get up here, the northern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, it's really very low-lying territory. This geography is important as you read Diamond and McEnany. So yeah, you want to pay attention to that. There's here we go. This shows both classic and post-classic sites, which is kind of a hint that people continue to do things after the end of the live here and have society and culture and after the end of the classic period. That's the focus of Diamond and McEnany's readings. This is a pre-classic Mayan site that was an important political center, perhaps capital of a kingdom in the last century BC. So Mayan civilization, these Mayan cities of the classic period, which lasted from about 250 AD to about 900 AD, that's the period of classic period. They didn't just come from nowhere. There was earlier development. And this is one of those places. This is possibly what it looked like. The reason these places are not considered to be classic Mayan centers is because the writing system was used sparingly. Right? These centers are not characterized by the copious use of writing to communicate the genealogy and the power of the rulers and the closeness of the kings to the gods and so forth. So a lot of the political and social organization of pre-classic Mayan centers has to be, based purely on archaeology. We don't know how they thought about themselves yet. The classic period, however, picks up at around 200 AD, when cities like Tikal and Calakmul and Copan, which is the city that Jared Diamond in his reading focuses most on, came to be characterized by the copious use of writing and sculpture to glorify the rulers and to justify their power. And so that's how it is that the classic period is distinguished from the pre-classic period. Is it has to do with the use of writing for the aggrandizement of the rulers. Also, take note that almost Diamond talks about the Mayan region as a whole in his presentation of ecocide, Mayan ecocide, but almost all of the actual research that he describes takes place in Copan. Do you think that the environmental effects of intensive agriculture in a highland center like Copan are actually representative of what was going on in the lowlands and further north in the plains of the northern Yucatan? I'll leave you to think about that. See this Coba up here? Coba is only about an hour away from the beaches of the Maya Riviera, and a couple years ago I went there with my brother and sister-in-law, and this is one of the last Mayan, they're called pyramids, but in fact they were the platforms for temples. And so they elevated the ruler up above the settlement so as to demonstrate that they were closer to the gods, that they were higher than the people, and that this so-called pyramid or platform for a temple would have been a symbolic center of that town. And what's neat to me is that it's one of the last ones that tourists can actually climb up. I do not think that it's a very good idea to allow tourists to climb on temple platforms or Mayan pyramids, but as long as everybody else is doing it, I really wanted to get this shot, because man, you would have had quite an inflated sense of self-esteem if you were the person that got to live on top of one of these things and looking down on all the people. And how much labor would it have taken to build this stuff, and how much power would a Mayan king have had to convince or coerce people to build these things for them? You also have to keep in mind that the whole thing would have probably been covered in lime plaster as well. That's my brother. This is a stela, or a carved plaque of the type that you'll see in the film that I've asked you to watch. And this is the it's all broken down in a drawing for you, and it tells the genealogy of the ruler that commissioned the building of that place and ruled over that town of Koba. Tikal and Calakmul were two of the largest and most powerful of the Mayan centers, and they each, in turn, sat atop a network of allied centers around them, such that you might think of them as capitals of competing kingdoms. But the Mayan area was never unified into an empire. It's more like Mesopotamia in that way, in that it was a cultural zone with many independent centers, city-states, if you will. And now I'm going to look at Tikal just a little bit, because Tikal, here's a beautiful picture of the ruins of Tikal. Maybe you recognize the top of this pyramid from Episode 4 of Star Wars: A New Hope. Yes, that is a background that they used for the Yavin base. Anyway, I digress again, trying to keep this, oh my god, 42 minutes, I gotta get going here. Here's another picture of Tikal. So this would have been downtown Tikal, the center of the so-called city. Have you noticed I've been a little squirrely talking about Mayan cities? I've been calling them centers. Many Mayan archaeologists themselves are a little bit uncomfortable calling these places cities because the infrastructure and the layout is very different from the places that we call cities in Western vernacular. So Mesopotamian cities, for example, right? Most of them had walls around them and gates to get into them, and there was a pretty clear distinction between inside the city and outside the city, between city and countryside. Part of the Mayan adaptation to a more or less rainforest environment. It's not a true rainforest because it's seasonal. It's not a tropical rainforest, I mean. So there's a dry season, and that's that's an important fact to keep in mind when you read about the droughts, so-called. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden everything dried up, but it means that there was less rain during the rainy season, and it made it harder to do to produce enough surplus to get through the dry season. But again, I digress. One of the things that was truly amazing about Mayan agriculture is that local farmers could be almost self-sufficient by draining swamps, by building raised fields with fish and turtles and such in the ditches that would be used to drain them, and then the sludge from the fish poop would be used to fertilize. So anyway, if we were on the chalkboard, I'd do all kinds of fun things. But Mayan farmers, point being, didn't have to do massive irrigation the way they did in Mesopotamia, and so farm families could basically set up shop almost anywhere, and that's kind of what we see in a place like Tikal. Those beautiful pictures there was the center of Tikal, which was the home of the ruling family, that as their power grew, they were able to continue to build on the temple platforms, and as they became giant pyramids, and the previous generations of rulers would be buried there, and stelae would be erected to honor them, and so on and so forth, yada yada yada. And then as we get further away, these are similar plazas with house, domestic temple, courtyard area of other families who, through their proximity to the ruling family, were probably relatives and nobility and so forth. And then as you go further out in the jungle, eventually the density of habitation gets less and less and less. And then as you were to move in the direction of another Mayan center, the density of habitation would increase greater and greater and greater until you were at the center of, let's say, Calakmul. And so there is basically continuous habitation all throughout this region. And these centers of important political families are what we call cities, or many Mesoamerican archaeologists would probably prefer epicenter. This is some recent work using a type of scanning technology called LiDAR, where you fly over the site and you shoot down lasers that can map the ground through foliage, and it allows us to see how this dispersed settlement from the center of Tikal, and it just sort of peters out into the forest. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. There's a nice slide showing all the different agricultural techniques that largely self-sufficient Mayan farmers used to produce the surplus food that they needed for their needs, as well as to support the ruling families at the centers of these epicenters. So what was the nature of power? How could a Mayan king, they called themselves Kahulajaw, or great lords, how could they have convinced and coerced largely self-sufficient farmers to pony up surplus to support the construction of big damn pyramids and such? Part of that goes back to the Olmec times, where the rulers were seen as important spiritual leaders of the people as well. So, if you were to take Archaeology of Social Change next semester in the fall, we're going to read a book on the Mayan civilization, wherein the author, Arthur Demarest, he describes the Kahulajaw, the great lords of the Mayan epicenters, as having been shamans in chief. That an important source of their power was, in fact, ideological power. That they were the ones that communicated with the gods and the divine and saw that the rains came as they should, and that the corn grew, and such. So we've seen a variation on that theme before, with the importance of the Egyptian pharaohs as religious figures, spiritual figures, as well as political figures, and that seems to have been an important part of Mayan rulers' power here as well. If you're the king, you got to look like the king, and so gift giving and the absolute control over highly valued resources like jaguar pelts and cocoa and stingray spines and obsidian and all of these sorts of fabulous things that could be used to make fantastic outfits and costumes, to demonstrate the power of the ruler, the leader, the Kahulajaw, was another source of their power. And, all good things must come to an end. I guess it was a good thing. I'm not sure that I would want to be a subject to a Kahulajaw, a god king who drafted people into armies to go to war with other kings. I just don't know that if I were a peasant person, which I probably would have been back in the day, that I would have thought that the downfall of my local king was actually a bad thing. I think it might have been a good thing. I might have been able to go upon my merry way. That's maybe a little bit more of a Macanani perspective than a Diamond perspective. But what did end 909 AD, again, a remarkably precise date, that's the date of the last stele marking an event in the life of a Mayan ruler. At the end of that period, which was indeed marked by considerable warfare and violence, but that was always kind of a part of the Mayan scene, with city-states or epicenters going to war with one another. There was a shift. Places like Tikal and Calakmul and Copan that had been important, Palenque, that had been important Mayan centers, they were in fact, well, the centers were largely abandoned. People continued to live in the countryside, but the Kahula were no longer politically important and politically powerful. They were no longer able to convince or coerce people to build monuments for them. And what did happen was that there was a shift in settlement to the north. Places like Copan, where I showed the picture of my brother climbing the pyramid, like that was one of the latest classic sites. Chichen Itza was occupied during the terminal classic period from about 900 to 1100 AD. So for about 200 years, this place was the center of an epicenter or a city. And what was different about it is that there are no rulers depicted here. The Kahula system of the shamans in chief who demonstrated their power and the connection to the gods by all their exotic fineries, that wasn't really a thing anymore. The power of Chichen Itza came from its location, and you don't see it here, but located along rivers that had allowed access to trade routes where it could trade with city-states that were emerging around the basin of Mexico. This would have been the time of the Toltec kingdom. And eventually the Aztec Empire that extended all the way through here, and that's in Olszewski, and it's not really a part of what we're doing in this class this week. But Chichen Itza and it was eventually conquered by Mayapan, and these places had a much more heterarchically organized governmental structure with councils of nobility and so forth who gained a lot of economic power through trade with other regions. So in some ways, maybe a much more sensible form of government. I would probably have been better off being a peasant, paying my taxes to Chichen Itza or Mayapan, and having perhaps my family might have something to say about the governance of these places. I mean, there was still war. I mean, this is not this is not a perfect egalitarian democracy by any means, but the era in the terminal and post-classic, the era of the great Mayan lords was indeed over. And of course, Diamond sees that as an example of ecocide, and McInerney and Negron have a very different perspective, and that's the kind of stuff that I would like you to write about. I'll end the little slideshow with another picture of the pyramid with the temple on top, so temple platform with the temple on top at Chichen Itza. And look at that. On certain days of the year, the shadow. I think it's on the summer solstice. The shadows form an undulating line that looks like a snake. God, that's cool. So, culture and society didn't end at the end of the classic period. The form of government changed, but there was still power. And there was a continuity from the earlier period. What there was a shift in settlement and a change in form.